yes, I'm going to be talking about freedom and how freedom ideologies have fueled tech-assisted child abuse. Now, why talk about this? It may seem quite a kind of amorphous left field topic, freedom. But fundamentally, what we do as a society is shaped by our values. If we think about the concept of the Overton window, which people may be familiar with, which is about the range of actions that we can take, that society, politicians see as legitimate, is called the Overton window. And that window can constrict, can move, depending on what our values are, or what we think other people value, what we are told that other people value. So, you know, we need to talk about this because these values are having a huge impact on what we see as legitimate actions to tackle tech-assisted child abuse. But often we're so busy downstream of the problem, trying to tackle it, whether it's, you know, through law enforcement, education, etc., that we're sometimes not actually taking a step back and going upstream and saying, hang on a minute, why has it become so endemic? Why is it an epidemic? What are the values in our society which are meaning that we have created a society so conducive to abuse? And sorry, can I ask the tech people, I've got a timer thing which is kind of blocking some of my slides, if that can be moved at all, just for me to read. Thank you. So freedom, I'm going to be talking about freedom, which is a particular focus within Western philosophy, politics, and economics, as is reflected in 4 dominant ideologies: free market, free speech, free internet, and sexual freedom. And, you know, I am not going to be arguing against freedom. I see freedom as absolutely core to human flourishing, and this really follows on from some of the things that Jono was talking about earlier around our autonomy. Autonomy is critical to meaning, thank you very much, to meaning, to flourishing, to well-being, and I'm going to come back to that. But the problem is that in our society, freedom has been narrated in a narrow, libertarian fashion. And this libertarian narration of it supports the freedoms of the more powerful and serves profit. It's about a freedom from constraints so that you can do what you want with the resources and power that you've got. And fundamentally, that has been absolutely disastrous for children. So let's zoom in a little bit on libertarianism. What is it? And there's a lot of fascinating psychological research on this. It is a distinct political stance in moral psychology, and it doesn't sit easily on the right or the left. In fact, it's had a lot of influence on both sides of the political spectrum in different ways. Free market, particularly on the right, and sexual freedom, particularly on the left. Its guiding principle is the immediate freedom of individuals. In particular, it's a freedom from the state, from rules. And this right trumps all other rights and concerns, such as moral values based on care, connection, altruism. The moral principles that it's generally wrong to harm others, that it's right to protect people from harm, in particular children, and that it's right to move towards greater equality. Those principles that most of us would actually value are relatively absent from libertarian philosophy. No, it's absolutely fine that some people, you know, are particularly focused on this narrow freedom, and they can do that. The problem is that they have had a disproportionate impact on all of these areas, and we need to think about why that is. And fascinating, this psychological studies looking at libertarians, comparing them to liberals and comparing them to traditional conservatives. This finds that this group, you know, it is a minority group that subscribe to these values. They tend to be much more cerebral than the average person, less empathic, less socially connected, less interdependent. Do we want that kind of person? Do we want, you know, again, fine to have those views and be like this, but do we want our society governed and influenced so heavily by this minority group? And what this research finds is that libertarians have a lower degree of the broad social connections that tend to typify liberals, as well as a lower degree of the tight social connections that typify conservatives. So why has it held so much sway? Well, fundamentally, this position legitimizes the positions of those with power and wealth. So those with power and wealth have found it and lifted it up and pushed it out there. It offers a simple, compelling vision, which is somewhat religious. Just follow your freedom and life will be okay. As we see with free market, just let the market do its thing. It will regulate itself. And then we find the same thing with the internet. It does resonate with this core human desire to be free, not to be held down by rules and constraints. And we're going to see it's been successfully galvanized and harnessed by those that profit from it and used to stigmatize those of us that might challenge it. You might come across terms like censorship, moral panic, hysteria, prudish, regressive, being thrown around to those of us that are trying to bring in some rules and regulations that protect the more vulnerable in society. And a lot of the time, these words don't need to be used very often. They just need to be used a few times, and they are then there as shame positions that we subconsciously seek to avoid. We don't want to be seen as the censorship or the prude or the hysterical one, so we'll just tone down a bit. And I can really see this in myself. Equally, deeper versions of freedom and other core values about care, love, protection, these have not been as articulated as, like I said, I think we've been too busy downstream to have the battle of ideas, which is what we need to be doing. And once, we now do have a fairly libertarian world order in the West, and once this is in place, we then have cognitive biases that could kick in to support the status quo. And again, I'm not going to go into all the research, but just world theory, system justification theory, we have natural biases to try and see the status quo as fairer and more legitimate than it actually is. And ultimately, for a lot of people, this is just easier. As Judith Herman, who wrote the seminal Trauma and Recovery in the 90s, said, "It is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. The victim, on the contrary, asks the bystander to share the burden of pain. The victim demands action, engagement, and remembering." So challenging the status quo isn't easy. It's much easier to believe in the power of unconstrained freedom and that it will all kind of work out okay in the end. So how do freedom ideologies operate? Well, grand abstractions are used to hide the unpalatable aspects. You'll hear these words: open, opportunity, creativity, connection, sex positive. And people like Mark Zuckerberg are real kind of talents at this. And we have all of these words, but we don't have the flowchart of the freedoms that are lost downstream when we allow the freedoms of the more powerful without enough rules and constraints. Isaiah Berlin in the 50s wrote a very influential philosophical paper delineating between different forms of freedom, the freedom from these rules, but there are also freedoms too, freedoms to make the most of life's opportunities, to be safe and secure, to live a life without abuse or discrimination, to author a sexuality that is rooted in respect and connection. These are freedoms that our children are fundamentally missing out on because the freedoms of those in power and to profit have been foregrounded instead of these much deeper freedoms. And the freedom to feel certain things is valorized, like greed or your sexual arousal, whereas other feelings are stigmatized or sidelined, like disgust, moral outrage, distress, or love. And fundamentally, this is inviting us to split apart different parts of ourselves. We're invited to ignore the part of us that's concerned and just to listen to the greed or the arousal. So I'm going to just spotlight, my main focus is cyber libertarianism, internet freedom, but I'm also just going to highlight briefly sexual freedom. I could also say a lot more about free market and free speech, but we can kind of come to that at some other points. And I have some papers that for people who are further interested. Sexual freedom. Now, of course, there should be freedom and positivity around good sexual experiences. There were some, fantastic products of the sexual revolution, and none of us would want to turn back the clock in that sense. But again, sexual freedom has been narrated along libertarian lines. So freedom's the focus, and that is simply following your arousal. The definition of sex positive in Wikipedia is an attitude towards human sexuality that regards all consensual sexual activities as fundamentally healthy and pleasurable, encouraging sexual pleasure and experimentation. Now, when you read that, you might think, yeah, that sounds fine, that sounds great. But I would argue it actually just won't do. This statement is abusogenic. That actually not all consensual sexual activities are healthy. And that what's happened with sexual freedom is that we've got this vague concept of freedom and consent that has replaced, again, what Donna was talking about earlier, core principles that are at the heart of a healthy and ethical sexuality around equality, honesty, communication, being attuned to one another, respecting each other, and thinking about the other person's best interests as well as your own. Now, if we follow those 6 principles, we end up in a very different place. Sex positive has typically ignored power dynamics or objectifying other people, sex that's in the search for self-worth or traumatic reenactment, where people might be consenting, but actually that's very conducive to feeling crap and to being abused. So that's just a word on sexual freedom. Again, we can come back to that. But then to zoom in on cyber-libertarianism. So when the internet first came about, there were features of it that disproportionately attracted libertarians to its development and to its narration. It absolutely was fueled by those other ideas around free market, free speech, sexual freedom. They all got kind of taken in. And then you have organizational dynamics at play. And again, there's research on this, looking at how organizations and the processes within them around hierarchy, around this kind of narrow focus on roles and goals, can actually mean that people start to lose their moral compass, and they act, and the organization starts to act in a much less ethical way than the individuals within it would if they were acting following their own true autonomy and values. And then you've got the influence of power and money. Again, research on this showing that when people have power and money, they are less able to think ethically. They are more likely to treat other people in a utilitarian way. And it really is affecting psychology and the brain. And actually, I did a little test the other day. If you look at how many of these big tech corporations are behaving, I looked up the criteria to be diagnosed as a psychopath. They are absolutely, if they were individuals, they would all be diagnosed psychopaths. So that's what's going on. But we as individuals have core values that are not then having that influence. And this has led to an online environment that is, just has these pernicious societal harms. On a mass scale, people have been manipulated through surveillance capitalism and the like, and invited to be worst parts of themselves, to find those worst parts of themselves and to indulge them. And we know how this has led to sexual abuse, but it's also led to a whole range of other societal problems that are damaging society. Here's a few examples of it in action. You may have heard Zuckerberg, move fast and break things. If you're not breaking stuff, you're not moving fast enough. Just follow your freedom. Technology is not a neutral force, but serves as an overwhelming positive force in human culture. We have a moral obligation to increase technology because it increases opportunities. Now, some of this rhetoric has fallen away a little bit as the harms have become more acknowledged, but the practice of cyber-libertarianism absolutely hasn't, and the battle is ongoing and is really raging, I would say, internationally as various jurisdictions look to regulate and come up against this ideology in a very powerful way. So what this leads to is a lot of internet doublethink. Many people implicitly adhere to a cyber-libertarian view of the online, despite not applying these principles elsewhere in their life. So, for example, it's illegal offline to sell porn to those under 18, and yet it's freely available to those online. We now even have sites who are actually quite open about that, showing porn while saying that they're appropriate for children. Twitter's a prime example. It says it's appropriate for 13-year-olds, and yet 13% of its content is porn. We've heard from the Children's Commissioner that Twitter is now the most common place for children to stumble across pornography. Porn that is actually illegal to even sell to adults offline is also freely available online, and some of this stuff is not really being tackled adequately in the online safety bill at the moment. Companies have child protection rules that their business model would seem to depend on them ignoring. Omegle is a good example of that. I mean, I've got examples of all of this. We have technological innovation speeding ahead when it's serving corporate interests, but crawling when it's about child protection. And governments have been so slow to regulate, asking for self-regulation in a way that would never be countenanced for another risk industry, say alcohol or tobacco. And, you know, suffice it to say, offenders got the memo. They got the freedom memo. They understood that the internet was the place that they could go to be free, to follow their arousal. As this offender says, it's like, you know, being in the Wild West. When you're in that bubble, it's like a very strange virtual world that you're in. And it becomes, you lose track of time, you lose track of place. But most importantly, I think, you lose track of morality. And that really cuts to the heart of this. The wonderful thing about the freedom ideology is that it can be endlessly reappropriated to serve the interests of the powerful. And you know, this very much follows on from what the Minister was saying earlier. Let's just have a little case example of Mark Zuckerberg and people's privacy. Mark Zuckerberg narrated freedom as not involving privacy initially. In 2010, privacy is no longer a social norm. People have gotten really comfortable sharing more information, different kinds, more openly with more people. What people want isn't complete privacy. So for him, freedom was narrated, you know, we don't want privacy, we've left that behind. But now that it's actually encryption will serve his profit, and you know, I'm hypothesizing here, but as online abuse goes up, the costs of content moderation also go up, and encryption saves Meta and others an awful lot of headache and work around moderation. So now he's saying, I believe that if we have a fully encrypted and operable system, that's going to be an important contribution to the world. To build a world where we can be ourselves and live freely and know that our private moments are only going to be seen by the people they want. Privacy gives people the freedom to be themselves and connect more naturally. So we just see this reappropriation. It's just tied to different things that those in power want. And fundamentally, the point here is that this is fueling child sexual abuse. Major platforms are involved in one or more of the following, and a number of others, it would seem to be that child sexual abuse is even a core part of their business model. So I'm going to just 6 key ways. Again, these will all be familiar to you. But these major platforms, including these, but many others, are doing one or more of the following: easily connecting children with those looking to exploit them, enabling paedophilic connections between like-minded individuals, allowing the circulation of CSAM material, enabling child trafficking, which, let's be clear, is selling children to be raped, exposing children to pornography, which we know then has a knock-on effect on child abuse, in particular peer-to-peer, and breaking children into a sexual economic culture that is so conducive to abuse. So what I mean by that is immersing children in an online culture where they are taught that a primary value is them being a sexual object. And, you know, just to quote here, so Michael Salter, a friend and colleague of mine, has recently submitted a research paper interviewing those on the front lines trying to tackle online child abuse. And, you know, they were just scathing about big tech and the problem. You know, so, for example, one of them, it is an internet which is ruled by oligarchs. The platforms are characterized by this pernicious elitism that clearly doesn't recognize children as valuable. So where do we go from here? I just want to have this conversation about values, and let's have this openly, and I want to encourage you all to be confident and on the front foot with this. We don't need to be apologetic about challenging these freedoms and championing other values. And here are some to start with. Let's be on the front foot with putting children first. In my opinion, their interests are more important than adult interests. Let's talk about the value of good human relationships and closeness and connection, love, truth, equality, safety, and fairness. These are all just as important as freedom. And when we do talk about freedom, let's have a richer conception of what we mean by that. I would argue that the reason why it resonates so powerfully for us is because it's actually a proxy for something even more important, which is autonomy. And this is the subject of a wide literature. We find that when people are more autonomous, they thrive, they have more sense of meaning, and it's very relational. It's not just about being an individual. It's about feeling that you are in the driving seat of your life, informed by those that love and care about you. But unlike just saying, let's free you from constraints, you're free, this project involves hard work. We enjoy fuller autonomy, not just by saying, you've got it, but when we value and respect each other, when we're supported in developing core skills such as self-awareness, critical reflection, when we have a range of opportunities from which we can choose, grow, pursue life goals, and when we live free from coercion, manipulation, authoritarianism, and discrimination. Those are 4 key threats to our autonomy. So if you give people the freedom to manipulate, to coerce, to discriminate, you are undermining core human autonomy. So let's confidently speak versions of freedom which reflect this richness. And that would lead to, I would argue, I'm just giving some real headlines here, but a structured online environment which clearly differentiates between adults and children and sexual and non-sexual content, which proactively detects CSAM and adults engaging in sexual interest towards children, that we approach the tech industry as a high-risk industry, just like others that we readily identify as such as smoking and alcohol, and that a proportion of their profits is spent on helping those that their environments lead to harm. Let's stop manipulative surveillance capitalism, and a law is only as good as its implementation. So it's very exciting that we've got things like the Online Safety Bill, but it's only good if it's actually going to be the people enforcing it are resourced and supported. So lastly, my final point is really listen to your deepest values and let them be your guide. Don't be ashamed of them, live by them, speak them, have these conversations. This isn't just about talking to politicians and policymakers, it's throughout our lives. This is about cultural change. Because I would argue that we have been subjected to a bamboozle, and there's a real risk here. As Carl Sagan says, one of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. It's captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you've given a charlatan power over you, you will almost never get it back. And we are in this situation, we're at that fork in the road, really. There's many people who have accepted the new status quo. And so for change, that requires those of us who are able to confidently say, no, I'm never going to let this be normal. And I'm really inspired by the words of Hannah Arendt in her writing about totalitarianism. She was often encouraged by other academics to keep it very dry, to keep her emotions out. And actually, she challenged that with these words: the natural human reaction to such conditions is one of anger and indignation, because these conditions are against the dignity of man. If I describe these conditions without permitting my indignation to interfere, then I have lifted this particular phenomena out of its context in human society and have thereby robbed it of part of its nature, deprived it of one of its important inherent qualities. So what I'm saying there is that as we study and work and look at this issue, feel how you feel, find your anger, find your sorrow, and find your fight. Thank you.